Joining me from Bondi Partners is former Howard Government Minister Peter McGauran. How are you, Pete?
Very well, Tim, although I'm still reeling from Australia Day.
It was a big day, big day. It was controversial as well, and we'll discuss Australia Day from many perspectives shortly, but let's begin with the proposed voice to Parliament and the challenges that is posing.
Yes, but remember that is wrapped up in Australia Day because we saw we saw on Thursday a conflation of circumstances. Australia Day, which we celebrate as our national day, Invasion Day, the Voice, Alice Springs violence, it all came together at once. And there was great controversy, there was extremities of language. Look, the Prime Minister has a big job on his hands now to recalibrate this debate because a lot of Australians will see it now. Firstly, they're tuning in where they haven't before, so at least the Voice now will be better known now. But they're beginning to see it as dividing us, as separation, and that's what he's got to address. Australians won't want us to be separate nations.
It was a perfect storm of stories, but let's unstitch it and compartmentalise each one if we can, and begin with the Voice, because the Prime Minister, we've seen him this morning say that these are radicals coming up, but really, if you look at it, they're not. Some of the objections to the Voice is coming from people that he thought would have supported this.
Exactly. Look, he is right to categorise Senator Lidia Thorpe and other protesters as being radical, and nothing will satisfy them because they have a different agenda. But there's a lot of people who are mainstream, who are reasonable, who have a disposition to vote for the Voice because it is something that indigenous leaders want. So it's too easy to say it's just radical. He's got a much bigger issue. He should just ignore the radical fringe and concentrate on people like me who want to vote for it, but at this stage are beginning to wonder whether or not it's asking for trouble.
Does the date have to change, Australia Day? Does the date, do we think it needs to change? Are the rallies and the points being put across the table too strong going forward to think that we can maintain Australia Day on January 26? What do you think?
Look, a lot of people are depressed that they think this is, if not the last Australia Day, certainly the beginning of the end. And it is true, there weren't as many Australian flags flying. Traditional activities were held. People still had a great time. Why not? It was great weather and everyone headed for the beaches. But if you shift the date, Tim, where does that get you? Suppose we shift it to Federation Day, January the 1st. Are we allowed to celebrate it as the beginning of our nation? If you shift it to pick any date, it's not the date that matters so much to me and most people, I suspect. It's more, what are we allowed to do on the day? Are we allowed to have our barbecues? Are we allowed to have our ceremonies? Are we allowed to have citizenship ceremonies? So shifting the date probably isn't the answer.
Alice Springs, the violent crime we're seeing, do you have to go back to just this blanket alcohol ban? Definitely, it was a mistake. I think the federal government's beginning to realise that, or is quietly behind the scenes pushing the Northern Territory government. They made a terrible mistake. That's what the indigenous communities want in Alice Springs. The violence is heartbreaking and nobody should tolerate it. And can you imagine if it was in any of the other cities or towns of Australia, we'd be sending in the SWAT squads. So I'm afraid everybody has been culpable in the harm and damage done to individuals and the community of Alice Springs more generally. Yeah, absolutely. Now, the inflation number, changing subjects, rate rises are inevitable now because we saw the inflation figure during the week. But what about this delicate balance for both the economy and the budget?
Yeah, you're right. 7.8% inflation rate was disappointing. It had been 7.5%. Look, it's hard for people who are struggling with cost of living pressures and high petrol prices and increasing interest rates when I say the Australian economy is very solid. It's strong. Booming exports because of agriculture and coal, gas and iron ore and minerals, the energy sector. Plus,
unemployment still at 3.5%, which is 50-year low, and corporate profits. So the government's budget is beginning to look as if it might actually get into surplus within 12 to 18 months, but they've got big spending on NDIS, defence, aged care and so on. The fundamentals are right in our economy. We're in a better position than most other economies throughout the world, but they're certainly paying for some time to come, because so long as inflation's high, as you say, Tim, then interest rates are going to be high.
Oh, absolutely, and it's more. It's not so much a comparison to the historical days when you and I bought properties and we were paying 18%. It's more that these younger people were told there won't be rate rises until 2024. So, look, let's do this all again next week.
Excellent, Tim. Thank you.
Peter McGauran.